Hey, this is Adam Driscoll, and today we're going to be looking at how to use Application Insights to actually log your PowerShell scripts up to Azure. So I have a PowerShell script here with a bunch of examples. Talk a little bit about how you can access the telemetry client and different ways to call it and where that's going to surface in Azure. So if you're running PowerShell 7, this is actually included automatically because the PowerShell team actually uses telemetry themselves to collect information about PowerShell starts and what languages and that kind of thing. I mean, what operating systems and that kind of thing PowerShell is running on. So you can actually just create a new client by using this line here, Microsoft Application Insights, Telemetry Client, New. From there, you can actually set up a couple things. The one requirement is setting your instrumentation key. So you can actually get this in your App Insights resource by just going to the overview page here and copying your instrumentation key. That is required so that it goes to the right place. From there, you can actually configure the context of the client. So this is a good location to put things like usernames, some session tracking. I'm using a process ID, but you could use a random generated GUID or like anything else that might help correlate where this script is coming from. So there's actually a bunch of stuff on this context object that provides more context to all the instrumentation data you are gathering. So let's start with kind of the most basic way to trace things in App Insights, and that is with the trace command. And this is mostly for like logging. So you would call track trace, pass in your message. That is actually the only required argument to that method. You could get rid of error here, but I'm including a severity, and you can see all the different severities here, which I think, just make sure I got that right. Yeah, so all the severities here include critical, error, information, verbose, and warning. So whatever you want to track is a severity there. So then you'll call this, and that will kind of queue up a trace message. To actually like force it up to Azure, you can click the client.flush, and that will kind of flush all the trace messages that have been gathered. So you don't have to do that, but if you kind of close the process before that completes, it's not actually going to end up in Azure. So this actually does take a little while to process. I have kind of run through this previously, so I have a bunch of examples of kind of where these things show up. So you can find pretty much all the App Insights information in this logs view. And it uses a query language here. And you can see that there's a bunch of tables on the left. Traces will show up in the traces table. And you can actually just say traces to have it list the records in there. And if I run that, you can see that I have a bunch of trace information. So I have my message that I sent in, severity level, the item type, the session ID, which is my PID, and then my user ID, which is the username I got out of my environment variable. And you can expand any one of these to see more information. And having it in this like log here allows you to do all kinds of stuff with it. You can process it, create charts and that kind of thing over time. And you can see this is actually grouping it based on the message that came in and that kind of thing. So when I use the user ID in the context, you also get information about the user in the usages area here. So once this loads, you'll see that I have 3 users, and you can view more insights about those users. And you'll see that these are like 2 different user accounts. And if I click View User Timeline, you'll see that this user ID was Adam D. I don't know why it thinks I'm in Las Vegas. I'm actually in Seattle. And then it has some information about the events that it's receiving for that user. So you could actually see like this script as it runs. All right, so let's look at another example of sending up something up to Application Insights, and that would be a metric. So metrics are just numeric values. So it could be a memory usage or a count of something like files or anything like that. So you could call track metric. And similar to the trace, we're always going to call flush afterwards. In this case, I'm going to call get random and just send that metric up. And where that surfaces is both in the logs view. You can always look at things in the logs view. But because it is a metric, you actually go to this metrics view and hit the drop down here for metric namespace. I want a custom one, and I want to select my metric. And now you can see that I am averaging it over time. So if you had a lot of these coming in, you could have a really good view of just counts of something. And you can name your metric whatever you want and then select it here. And there's like options to save this to your dashboard and that kind of thing. So yeah, you can have multiple metrics on a graph like this. So if you're collecting multiple metrics or like looking at the same metric in different ways, you could do it that way. All right. So the other thing that you can do with metrics is kind of provide some additional information. So it has this like arbitrary collection or dictionary of strings that you can pass in. So I'm getting the lang string environment variable, and I can send that in with my metric. And you'll be able to view that in the log view if you want to provide additional information about certain metrics. Another method you can call is track page. Application Insights kind of has a lot of concepts for like ASP.NET Core web apps. So in this case, track page really doesn't make sense in a PowerShell script necessarily, but I thought it would be kind of interesting to actually use that as kind of execution of a script, So you could say my invocation, my command name, which would be the app insights.ps1 name. And then you could effectively say that this script was, executed this many times, and it's going to show up in the page view drop down. So there's actually, oops, not activity log. Like right on the homepage, there's actually like, requests and stuff like that. So server requests, it could be like a page view, So it's just one way you can kind of override that. And if you look in the logs, and I were to actually get the page views, run that, you'll see that the name of my page is coming in as appinsights.ps1. So there's a couple of other ways we can kind of use some of the similar concepts of like, a service, HTTP, like response times and stuff like that in your script. And I'll show that with some of these measure commands. So now let's look at tracking exceptions. So this is actually extremely useful for PowerShell scripts. They have a track exception command where I'm creating a new exception, but you could have your try catch block do this. So look at that. GitHub Copilot did that for me. And you can see here we're catching an exception, we're tracking that exception and sending it up to App Insights. So I am going to call this, and you'll see that it will pretty much send that up to App Insights for me. And if I actually come over here, you can actually go to the failures view for this. And the failures view is really nice because it has this nice like overview, so you can see how many failed requests came in. And it gets really cool because you can see that we have top 3 exception types. So I'm passing in a system.exception, so that's why it's just exception. But if it's a different exception type, you'll see that here. You can actually click on this, and it will give you like an example of all the exceptions if you want. And you can see I'm actually getting my my exception message in there, and you can click into that exception, and it's going to have like the call stack and stuff if it's available and everything. So it's a great way to kind of debug your scripts. It gives you a bunch of information. All right, I came up with a little function here because the next one I want to show off is called track request. And the idea with this is, it'd be like a web request or something like that, where you pass in a name, you pass in like a start date, like when did this request start, and then you pass in the elapsed time. So I'm going to use a stopwatch to do that. Then you're going to pass in a status message and whether or not the request was successful. So I made a little like helper function here that accepts a name and a script block. It starts a stopwatch. It runs that script block. If that script block throws an exception, we're going to get the exception text there. And if that script block throws an exception, it won't be okay anymore. So then we're going to say that request failed. So I have this little script block here that we're calling, we're calling start sleep. And just for a random 1 to 5 seconds. And then I just named this sleeping. So let's measure that. So it actually will send that request up, and you could actually track that in the requests view, or you could look at it in the logs. So let's take a look at that, because you have like response times and stuff like that. But if we just look at the requests, you'll see that we have a bunch of information. So if it passes, our result code is okay, our success is true. We have information about the duration, so you can see that there. And then I also had some failures when I removed some parameters, and you can see that the success was false in this case, and the positional parameter cannot be found. And it also includes the duration and everything. So as you can see, there's a whole bunch of information about kind of where this came from. All right. Another cool one is dependency. So kind of my understanding about this is like, I'm calling a remote dependency to make sure that it's up. So in this case, I called this dependency, this is the type of dependency, this is the dependency I'm testing, this is just some arbitrary data, this is the start time, the elapsed time, and whether or not that dependency is, up and running. So with track dependency then, I'm calling invoke web request here in my little test URL, and I'll pass in the URL, I'll start the stopwatch here, I'll call invoke web request, and then I will call track dependency, and if it was successful or not, then it will pass in either true or false into the status. And yeah, so ironmansoftware2.com does not exist, and I can call that, and it failed, and it sent my track dependency. If I put in something that does exist, save that, execute it, you can see the invoke web request succeeded down in my console there. And it tracked that dependency up there. So obviously we can look at it in here. If you go to dependencies to see if your dependencies are up and running. And you can see that it's got the type, it's got the name and target and that kind of thing. And it also includes duration and all that kind of stuff, success or failure. And the other place that you see that is in the failures page. So if you go here and you go to the bottom, you can see that I have top 3 failed dependencies. So the type is listed here, and then which ones. And you can actually go and drill down and see like ironmansoftware2.com is not responding pretty much. So it's another way you could kind of track your scripts, or even use a script to track dependencies, maybe not even that apply to the script in particular. Yeah, so another view of the dependencies there. So yeah, this video is kind of all about how you can use the built-in Application Insights DLL that's in PowerShell 7 to track your scripts in a bunch of different ways. So this script will be up on my GitHub repo, and if you like videos like this, definitely subscribe to my channel.